Are you confused by their sudden silence? Did you do something wrong, or is your mind inventing reasons to survive the discomfort? Why does an empath go quiet as if a door inside them has closed without warning? And why does that quiet feel louder than any argument? Imagine a room at night with a single lamp on a table. The lamp does not flicker, it does not explode. It simply goes dark quietly without drama. And in the darkness, you suddenly hear everything you were avoiding: your own breath, your own thoughts, your own fear. Here is the twist. The problem is not the silence itself, and it is not even the people around the empath. The true event is psychological. Something inside the empath has shifted from persona to truth, from ego management to self protection, from performing connection to demanding meaning. When an empath suddenly goes quiet, the unconscious is sending a signal, and if you are wise, you will pay attention not because you must chase them, but because the silence reveals a deeper mechanism at work: ego, persona, projection, shadow, and the long hidden pull of the self. In today's video, we will enter that silence like a dark forest, not to romanticize it, but to read it. We will examine why the empath disappears without explanation, why the quiet arrives like a verdict, what it means when the empath stops negotiating, and what the psyche is truly doing when it withdraws. Are you ready to see what most people refuse to see because it forces them to confront the parts of themselves they keep sedated? Number one, the empath's quiet is not absence, it is the collapse of persona. In Jungian terms, the persona is the social mask, the face you present to survive the tribe. The empath often develops a refined persona early, sometimes too early, because their environment trained them to be pleasing, safe, intuitive, non-threatening. The empath becomes fluent in reading the room before they ever learn to read themselves. They learn to anticipate moods, soften conflicts, carry emotional weather. They become the emotional diplomat in every room, every family, every relationship, and for years, this mask feels like virtue. It even earns praise. People call them mature, kind, understanding, strong. But every persona has a cost, and Jung would say the cost is always paid in the currency of inner life. The more you identify with the persona, the further you drift from the self, the more you perform goodness, the less you know what you actually feel. The empath becomes a master of emotional labor and a stranger to their own center. Here is the image: a beautiful mask carved from wood, painted carefully, carried everywhere. At first it feels light, then it begins to cut into the skin. Then it starts to fuse with the face, and one day the face underneath begins to ache. The smile becomes heavy. The eyes behind it begin to burn. And finally, the empath has a moment where they cannot breathe under the mask anymore. They do not announce this. They do not negotiate it. They simply remove themselves. In everyday life, this looks like something small: a delayed reply, a short message, a sudden pause after years of being available. You send something playful and they answer with a single word. You ask what's wrong and they say, nothing. But it does not feel like nothing. It feels like a door closing. You can sense the withdrawal, not as punishment, more like exhaustion turning into clarity. And this is where most people make the fatal mistake. They interpret the empath's silence as manipulation, coldness, or pride, but in truth, the empath is experiencing something far more intimate: persona fatigue. The social self is collapsing because it cannot carry the weight of false connection anymore. Let me tell you a mini story. There is a woman named Elena. Elena is known as the one who always replies. She always checks in. She remembers birthdays. She notices subtle changes in tone. She apologizes first, even when she doesn't understand what she did. People call her warm. They also call her easy to talk to. Over time, Elena begins to realize something. Her warmth is being used as a public utility. One night, she rereads her last 20 conversations. She sees how many times she asked questions and how rarely anyone asks hers. Her chest tightens, not with anger, but with grief. The next day, someone texts her a complaint. Something small and entitled. Elena stares at the message. Her fingers hover over the screen. She feels the persona rise, ready to soothe, ready to fix. And then something inside her refuses. She puts the phone down. She does not answer. Minutes become hours. Hours become days. Elena's silence is not revenge. It is the moment her inner life finally votes for itself. Jung would say this is the psyche's attempt to restore balance. When the persona becomes too dominant, the unconscious responds with symptoms: fatigue, resentment, emptiness, a sudden urge to withdraw, not because the person is weak, but because the self is demanding space. And once you see this, you begin to understand. When an empath suddenly goes quiet, it is often the end of performing connection and the beginning of facing truth. Number two, the empath's quiet is the ego losing control of the narrative. The ego wants explanations. It wants to organize life into stories that make it feel safe. It asks, who is right? Who is wrong? Who started it? What does this mean about me? The ego is a manager. It monitors image, control, survival. But the self, the deeper center of the psyche, is not interested in your social story. The self is interested in wholeness, and wholeness often requires disruption. This is why people fear the unconscious. It does not care about your polite timeline. It does not ask permission. It brings the hidden to the surface. And it does so when the soul is ready, not when the ego is comfortable. Here is the image: a river beneath ice. On the surface, everything looks still. People walk over it. They assume it is stable, but underneath, the current is moving, stronger than anyone can see. Then one day the ice cracks, not with a dramatic explosion, but with a sharp sound that changes everything. The empath's quiet is that crack. The ego can no longer maintain the image of I'm fine, I can handle it, I don't need anything, I'm just being supportive. We said in everyday life, the empath's ego has often been trained to survive through control, controlling emotions, controlling reactions, controlling needs. They learn to swallow disappointment quickly and call it understanding. They learn to rationalize disrespect and call it compassion. They learn to tolerate inconsistency and call it giving people grace. But eventually, the ego cannot keep spinning the story without collapsing. This is when the empath suddenly becomes quiet, not because they are indecisive, but because the ego story has been exposed as a lie. They cannot pretend anymore. They cannot talk their way out of what they now see clearly. Silence becomes the only honest response. Take a quiet pause. Breathe more slowly. Consider how many times you have used words to avoid truth. How many times you have explained yourself when your soul was simply begging you to stop. Let me tell you another mini story. There is a man named Adrian. Adrian is the good listener. He becomes the emotional container for friends, co-workers, partners. One day his partner criticizes him casually in front of others again. People laugh. Adrian smiles. He even makes a joke about himself. But inside, something drops. That night, he stands in the bathroom mirror and stares at his own face like he is meeting a stranger. He realizes he has been shrinking for years to keep the peace. The next morning, his partner texts, "Are you still mad?" Adrian looks at the message. He feels the ego reaching for a polite reply. He also feels something deeper cold, calm, certain. He writes nothing. He goes quiet, not because he wants to be chased, but because his inner authority has finally appeared, and it does not negotiate with disrespect. Jung believed that when the ego loses its ability to maintain a false adaptation, the psyche forces a correction. Silence becomes a boundary, a spiritual line drawn without drama. And once you see this, you will understand when the empath goes quiet, the ego is no longer the ruler, a deeper center has taken the throne. Number three, the empath's quiet is the shadow rising, asking to be acknowledged. The shadow is everything you deny, suppress, reject. It is not only dark in the moral sense, it is also your unlived life, your buried anger, your forbidden needs, your suppressed strength. Many empaths have a particular relationship with shadow. They fear it. They equate anger with cruelty. They equate boundaries with selfishness. They equate self-interest with sin. So they exile their power into the shadow and become safe, agreeable, endlessly tolerant. But the shadow does not disappear. What you refuse to own becomes autonomous. It grows in the dark, and Jung would say, what you do not bring into consciousness will be lived as fate. Here is the image. A locked room in a house. The empath keeps it locked because they are afraid of what's inside. They decorate the living room. They invite guests. They clean the kitchen. They smile, but behind the locked door, something is pacing, a wild animal, a starving part of the soul. And one day, the door begins to shake. Not because the empath is becoming evil, because they are becoming whole. This is why the empath's quiet can feel cold, because it is infused with shadow energy. It is infused with years of swallowed anger, finally organizing itself into clarity. Shadow does not always scream. Sometimes it speaks in silence. Sometimes it says, "No more." Sometimes it simply withdraws warmth and stops feeding what has been feeding on it. In everyday life, shadow awakening looks like the empath no longer explaining, no longer softening the truth, no longer making excuses for other people's behavior. They stop participating in the old emotional economy, and people feel threatened by this, not because the empath is doing something harmful, but because the empath is no longer easy to manipulate. Mini story. There is a woman named Mira. Mira grew up in a home where anger was dangerous. When her father got angry, it was chaos. When her mother got angry, it was guilt. So Mira learned to be calm, gentle, invisible. She becomes an adult who can handle anything. She dates a charming man who subtly mocks her sensitivity. He calls her too intense when she expresses needs. Mira laughs it off. For years, then one evening he crosses a line in a public setting again. Mira feels the old reflex. Swallow it. Stay kind. Keep the peace. But this time the shadow stands up inside her like a tall figure in a dark coat. Mira's voice does not shake. She says nothing. She looks at him with a kind of stillness that makes him uncomfortable. Later, he texts her, "Why are you being like this?" Mira reads it and realizes her silence is not passive. It is power returning. Jung would say that integrating the shadow is not becoming cruel, it is becoming truthful. The empath's quiet is often the first visible sign that shadow integration has begun. They are no longer afraid of their own hardness. They are no longer terrified of being misunderstood. They are no longer sacrificing wholeness to remain liked. And once you see this, you will understand the empath's quiet is often the shadow finally stepping into daylight without apology. Number 4, the empath's quiet exposes projection, yours and theirs. Projection is the mechanism by which we place inner content onto other people. We assume others carry our motives, our wounds, our fears. We see them through our inner lens. Projection is not a moral failure, it is a psychological function. But when it becomes unconscious, it becomes destructive. It creates false intimacy, false enemies, false stories. Empaths are especially vulnerable to projection because they feel deeply, sense subtleties, and often confuse intuition with certainty. They may unconsciously project their goodness onto others. If I would never do that, they must not mean it. They project their loyalty onto inconsistent people. They project their empathy onto those who cannot reciprocate. In doing so, they remain bound to illusions. But there is another kind of projection happening when the empath goes quiet. Other people project onto the empath. They assume the empath's silence is punishment, manipulation, drama, arrogance, a tactic. They cannot accept that someone can withdraw without hatred. They cannot comprehend a quiet boundary because their own psyche is wired to control through noise. Here is the image. A cracked mirror. You stare into it and your face looks distorted. You think the distortion is reality. You forget the mirror is broken. The empath's silence is like someone finally telling you the mirror was never whole. In everyday life, this shows up as frantic interpretation. Why aren't they responding? What did I do? Are they abandoning me? Are they trying to teach me a lesson? The mind starts spinning, and often the spinning reveals more about you than about them, because silence is a blank screen. People project their shadow onto blank screens. This is why the title matters. If an empath suddenly goes quiet, pay attention. Not only to them, pay attention to what rises in you. What story do you immediately invent? What fear awakens? What guilt? What need to control? What craving for reassurance? Take a quiet pause. Breathe more slowly. Let the silence show you what you normally drown out. Mini story. There is a man named Jonas. Jonas is close friends with an empath named Lila. Lila has always been supportive late night calls, long voice messages, thoughtful check-ins. One week Lila goes quiet. Jonas sends a meme, no reply. He sends a hey, nothing. Jonas begins to panic. He feels irritation, then guilt, then fear. He tells himself she is selfish, then tells himself he is unlovable. He checks their last conversations like a detective. Finally, Lila replies days later, I needed space. I realized I was abandoning myself. Jonas feels a sting, not because she is wrong, because her truth reveals his dependence. In that moment, Jonas sees something. He was not missing Lila. He was missing the function she served in his psyche. The projection collapses, and Jonas begins to meet himself. Jung would say projection is withdrawn not through thinking, but through suffering, honesty, and inner work. Silence often forces projection to return. The empath becomes quiet, and the world is forced to face itself. And once you see this, you will understand the empath's quiet is not just about them, it is a mirror event. It reveals what everyone else has been outsourcing. Number 5, the empath's quiet is the psyche preparing for individuation. Individuation is the journey of becoming whole, not becoming perfect, not becoming better, becoming integrated, less split, less false, less performative. Individuation often begins when the old identity fails, when the persona breaks, when the ego collapses, when relationships that depend on your old role begin to fracture. The empath who goes quiet is often at the threshold of individuation. They have been living as a role, the healer, the listener, the rescuer, the emotionally wise one, the container, and one day the self demands, enough, not because love is wrong, but because self erasure is not love. It is a spiritual illness disguised as virtue. Here is the image, a path through a dark forest. For years, the empath has walked the same road toward others, toward their needs, toward their moods. It becomes familiar, but there is another path, narrow, quiet, overgrown. It leads inward. The empath has avoided it because it feels selfish. But the self calls them down that path, and when they step onto it, they become quiet, not because they are dying, but because they are finally listening. In daily life, individuation looks like the empath no longer being instantly accessible. It looks like fewer explanations. It looks like refusing emotional chaos. It looks like choosing solitude without bitterness. It looks like the death of the old identity that kept them safe. This is also why the empath's quiet can feel irreversible, because once individuation begins, you cannot fully return to the old mask. You cannot unsee what you have seen. You cannot go back to being fine with what once wounded you. Let me give you one practical practice here, not as a list, but as an invitation. If you are the empath who has gone quiet, or if you feel the urge to, begin to write at night, not about what happened, but about what your silence protects. Ask yourself gently, what role am I retiring from? What emotional labor have I been doing to earn love? What am I afraid will happen if I stop? Let the answers come slowly. Let the unconscious speak in images, not just words. You may be surprised. Sometimes what you call love is actually a trauma strategy, an ancient bargain with life. And here is another practice, active imagination, the Jungian art of inner dialogue. Sit in quiet for 10 minutes. Imagine the part of you that is silent as a figure. What does it look like? A wolf? A wise elder? A tired mother? A cloaked guardian at a gate? Speak to it. Ask, what are you protecting? Listen without forcing. Often the silent part is the self's messenger. It carries the truth your persona refused to say out loud. Mini story. There is a woman named Sienna. Sienna is an empath who has always been the bridge between people. She mediates family conflicts, smooths workplace tension, carries friends through crises. One month, she begins to feel numb. Her body aches. Her sleep becomes shallow. She starts having dreams of a house with a locked door. One evening, she sits alone, and for the first time, she admits she is tired of being needed. The next day, her phone buzzes with requests. She stares at the screen and feels something unfamiliar. Indifference, not cruel indifference, holy indifference. She realizes her silence is not emptiness. It is a return, a turning inward. Sienna does not announce it. She simply begins living differently. And when people accuse her of changing, she does not defend herself. She is too busy becoming real. Jung would say individuation is not popular. It breaks the spell of roles. It disappoints those who benefited from your unconscious contract. But it is the only path to the self. And once you see this, the next layer is unavoidable. The empath's quiet is often the beginning of a psychological rebirth, silent, severe, and sacred. Number 6. The empath's quiet is a boundary spoken in the language of the unconscious. Most people think boundaries are sentences. They imagine boundaries as speeches. I need this. I won't tolerate that. Please respect me. But for the empath, especially the empath who has been trained to be pleasing, boundaries often begin before language. They begin in the body. They begin as a tightening in the throat, a dull pressure behind the eyes, a fatigue that feels ancient. The psyche does not always deliver boundaries as articulate declarations. Sometimes it delivers them as silence. And silence is not the absence of communication. Silence is communication without negotiation. Jung would say the unconscious speaks in symbols, not bullet points. It speaks in moods, dreams, compulsions, and sudden shifts. When the empath goes quiet, the psyche is drawing a line that words would only soften. Silence becomes a gate. It says, without saying, you do not get access to me by default anymore. It says, you do not get my warmth while you disrespect my center. It says, I no longer trade my peace for your approval. I said, here is the image, a temple with a heavy door. For years, the door was open. People walked in with muddy shoes. They left mess behind. They spoke loudly in holy rooms. The empath cleaned up after them, smiling. Then, one day, the empath closes the door, not with rage, but with ceremony. The door does not slam, it simply shuts, and the click of that lock is louder than any argument. In everyday life, this boundary shows up in tiny events. Someone makes a cruel joke and expects the empath to laugh. The empath doesn't. Someone sends a last-minute request that assumes availability. The empath doesn't respond. Someone criticizes them casually as if they are a tool. The empath goes silent, and the silence makes the other person uncomfortable because it removes their usual power. The power of provoking a reaction, the power of extracting reassurance, the power of forcing emotional labor. This is why silence is so frightening to those who depend on the empath's responsiveness. They are used to the empath filling every gap. They are used to the empath smoothing over awkwardness. They are used to the empath making everyone feel okay. When the empath goes quiet, it reveals how many relationships were not built on mutuality, but on extraction. Mini story. There is a man named Calvin. Calvin has an empath friend, Nora, who always answers always. Calvin vents to her after work, sends long messages about his frustrations, expects immediate comfort. One evening he sends her a complaint that is unusually sharp, almost insulting, because he assumes she will forgive him. Minutes pass, hours pass, Nora does not reply. Calvin feels irritation rise, then anxiety. He sends another message, hello, no response. The next day he wakes up with a strange heaviness. He realizes something. Nora has been his emotional trash bin. He has never asked how she is. He has never offered the same patience. Nora's silence is a boundary that forces Calvin to face himself, and it changes him if he is willing to learn. Jung believed that when unconscious patterns persist, the psyche will introduce disruption. Silence is disruption. It interrupts the old script. It refuses the old ritual. It demands a new level of consciousness. And once you see this, you understand why an empath's quiet is not passive. It is a boundary with teeth. Number 7, the empath's quiet is what happens when love stops being a trauma response. This is uncomfortable, and that is why it is true. Many empaths learned love as survival. They learned to keep people calm to stay safe. They learned to be needed to avoid abandonment. They learned to anticipate emotions to avoid punishment. They learned to overgive to secure belonging. And so love became fused with anxiety. Love became fused with labor. Love became fused with self-erasure. In Jungian terms, this is not love that rises from the self. It is adaptation that rises from the wounded ego. It is a strategy. It is a pact with childhood. If I am good enough, no one will leave. If I carry everyone, I will be valuable. If I am endlessly understanding, I will not be harmed. And codons, but the self does not want you to be valuable. The self wants you to be real. The empath's quiet often arrives when the psyche can no longer tolerate love as survival, when the empath realizes that what they call compassion is actually fear, fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of being disliked, fear of being alone. So the empath stops speaking, not because they stop loving, but because they stop loving from fear. Here is the image: a candle that has been burning in a windy room for years. The empath cups their hands around it constantly, protecting the flame from everyone else's storms. Their hands become burned. Their wrists ache. One day they stop cupping. The flame flickers. The room goes darker. People complain. But the empath realizes they were never meant to keep everyone warm. They were meant to become fire from within. In everyday life, this looks like the empath no longer rescuing, no longer fixing people, no longer sending paragraphs explaining feelings to someone who enjoys misunderstanding them, no longer chasing resolution with people who feed on chaos. They become quiet because they refuse to keep bleeding into relationships that do not change. Take a quiet pause, breathe more slowly. If you are the one watching the empath go quiet, Ask yourself, were they loving you or managing you? Were they supporting you or preventing your growth? Sometimes an empath's silence is the greatest act of love they can offer. They stop enabling the parts of you that refuse to mature. Mini story. There is a woman named Daphne. Daphne has always attracted troubled partners. She feels their pain instantly. She wants to heal it. Her current partner, Marcus, is emotionally erratic, warm one day, cold the next. Daphne spends years trying to understand him, trying to soothe him, trying to love him into stability. One night, Marcus explodes over something trivial. Daphne tries to calm him. He accuses her of being controlling, of being too sensitive, of always making things about feelings. In the middle of his rant, Daphne feels something detach inside her. She does not cry. She does not argue. She simply becomes still. Marcus grows louder because he senses he is losing access. Daphne listens, then quietly says, "I'm done explaining." She turns off her phone. That night, her silence is not punishment. It is liberation from the identity of healer. Daphne's quiet is the moment love stops being her trauma costume. Jung would say this is the dissolution of a complex, the collapse of an unconscious pattern that once ruled the personality. When a complex loses energy, the person becomes calm, quiet, centered, almost frighteningly clear. And once you see this, that is why the empath silence feels different from ordinary silence. It carries an inner verdict. The old pattern is over. Number 8, the empath's quiet reveals the hidden contract. There is always a contract, often unspoken, between an empath and the people around them. The contract says, "I will be available, and you will feel safe. I will forgive quickly, and you will not have to change. I will carry emotional weight, and you will not have to grow." This contract is rarely conscious. It is written in childhood ink. It is reinforced by praise. It is maintained by guilt. But contracts are fragile. They depend on unconscious agreement. And the moment one side becomes conscious, the contract breaks. The empath's sudden quiet is often the sound of that contract tearing. Here is the image, a thread connecting two people. For years, the thread is thick and bright. It looks like love, but it is also dependency, obligation, silent expectation. One day the empath stops pulling on the thread. The thread slackens. The other person feels it and panics. They yank, they provoke, they accuse, they plead, but the empath does not move. Not because they do not care, but because the contract was never love. It was captivity disguised as closeness. In everyday life, the contract reveals itself through reaction. If you respect someone, their silence may confuse you, but you will not rage at it. You will not demand access. You will not punish them for needing space. But if you feel entitled to them, their silence will ignite you. You will interpret it as betrayal. You will feel abandoned. You will attempt to force them back into the role you miss, the role of emotional supplier. This is where the most important psychological insight appears. Your reaction to an empath's silence exposes your relationship to control. Mini story. There is a man named Theo. Theo is dating an empath named Claire. Claire has always been attentive. She remembers details. She checks in. She adjusts her schedule around Theo's mood. Theo enjoys it, without realizing he is becoming dependent on it. One week, Claire becomes distant. Theo sends a message, "Where are you?" Claire replies calmly, "I'm focusing on myself right now." Theo feels rage, not because she is wrong, because the contract is breaking. He calls her selfish. He says she's changing. He threatens to leave. Claire stays quiet. She doesn't defend. She doesn't panic. Theo hears the silence and realizes he cannot control her anymore. Days later, he remembers how little he has given back. Claire's silence reveals his entitlement. It becomes a mirror. Theo has a choice: mature or collapse into manipulation. Claire's quiet forces the truth. Jung would say that unconscious contracts are maintained by projection. We project roles onto others and demand they play them. When a person withdraws from the role, the projection breaks and the psyche must confront reality. And once you see this, the next layer is clear. Silence is not merely withdrawal from you. It is withdrawal from a role you assigned them. Number 9. The empath's quiet is the body's revolt when the nervous system refuses to participate. Many people try to interpret empath silence morally. They're cold, they're immature, they're avoidant, they're dramatic. But often the empath's silence is physiological. The body has had enough. Empaths absorb, they track emotional microsignals, they feel what is unspoken, they often live in a state of hypervigilance without calling it that. They can anticipate conflict before it happens. They can sense tension like electricity. Over time, their nervous system becomes overloaded, and the psyche has a built-in protective mechanism: shutdown. Silence is sometimes shut down, not as punishment, as survival. Here is the image: an overworked instrument, a violin string pulled too tight. It does not snap with a warning speech, it snaps with a simple sound, then stillness. The empath's quiet is the nervous system saying, "If I keep playing, I will break." Fiven, in everyday life, you see this when the empath stops attending gatherings, stops answering calls, sleeps more, becomes less expressive. They may even become numb. They may say they feel nothing. That numbness is not emptiness. It is the psyche protecting itself from overwhelm. It is the body finally speaking after years of being ignored. This is why an empath's quiet should be taken seriously, not as drama, but as data. Their system is telling the truth. Take a quiet pause. Breathe more slowly. Notice your own body. Does it tighten when you think of conflict? Does it collapse when you think of explaining yourself? Your body carries your unconscious history. Mini story. There is a woman named Hannah. Hannah works in a demanding office. She is the one who senses everyone's stress and tries to lighten it. Her boss is emotionally unpredictable. Her co-workers vent constantly. Hannah listens, helps, smooths. At home, her family expects her to be the calm one. Months pass. Hannah begins waking up exhausted. She feels a pressure in her chest. She starts avoiding messages. One day a friend texts her, "Why are you ignoring me?" Hannah stares at the words and suddenly tears spill, not because she hates her friend, but because her body cannot give anymore. She turns off her phone and sits in silence. In that silence, she finally hears herself. Her body has revolted against the role. Hannah's quiet is a biological boundary. Jung would say the psyche speaks through the body when the ego refuses to listen. Symptoms are messages. Withdrawal is communication. Silence is sometimes the only language left when words have been abused. And once you see this, you understand the empath's quiet is not always a choice, it is an instinct. Number 10, the empath's quiet is a warning. Something sacred is being protected. This is where the tone changes, because the topic becomes almost spiritual, not religious in a loud way, sacred in an unconscious way. There is something in the empath that becomes untouchable after a certain awakening. It may be their dignity, their inner child, their future, their calling, their peace, their sense of self, and when that sacred thing is threatened repeatedly through disrespect, manipulation, neglect, the empath becomes quiet as an act of protection. Jung believed the self is not merely psychological. It has a numinous quality. It feels like destiny when you touch it. It feels like grace. It feels like a center that exists beyond social approval. When the empath begins to orient to that center, the old world loses power. The loud people lose influence. The guilt loses its grip. Silence becomes natural because the empath is listening for something deeper. Here is the image. A small flame in the center of a storm. The empath does not shout to defend it. They do not argue with the wind. They simply cup the flame and step away from the storm. Silence is the movement away. Silence is the refusal to keep the flame in places that extinguish it. In everyday life, this looks like the empath refusing low-level disrespect, refusing emotional chaos, refusing relationships that consume their spiritual energy. They become quiet because they are no longer willing to trade the sacred for the familiar. Mini story. There is a man named Raphael. Raphael has always been the nice one. He is gentle, patient, accommodating. He has friends who mock him affectionately, partners who take his warmth for granted. One day, Raphael has a dream. He is carrying a lantern through a dark forest, and people keep trying to blow it out. He wakes up shaking. He doesn't fully understand, but he feels it. Something inside him wants to live. That day, when someone tries to pull him into drama, Raphael goes quiet. He doesn't argue, he simply removes himself. His silence is not weakness, it is reverence. He is protecting the lantern. He is protecting the self that is awakening. That silence becomes his new religion, not a doctrine, but an inner loyalty. Jung would say the psyche becomes most powerful when it is oriented toward the self, when you stop living by the persona and begin living by inner truth. The world reacts, people resist, but the self does not negotiate. And once you see this, you are ready for the deeper descent. Because now we must go where most people refuse to go, into projection, shadow, and the moment the empath finally turns inward completely. Number 11. The empath's quiet is the moment projection is withdrawn and reality begins. Now we arrive at the blade edge of Jungian psychology, because here is where the illusion breaks. Projection is the invisible glue that binds people together in false intimacy. You do not love the person as they are, you love what you imagine them to be. You do not fear the person as they are, you fear what your unconscious paints onto them. Projection is not stupidity, it is psychic economy. It saves energy by turning the world into a mirror of your inner world. Empaths project in a particular way. They project soul into the ordinary. They project meaning into crumbs. They project potential into people who have shown no evidence of growth. They project remorse into those who only feel irritation. They project depth into those who live on the surface. And because the empath can feel subtlety, they confuse sensitivity with accuracy. They think, I sense something good in them, and they build a whole relationship around that sensed goodness, ignoring the visible behavior in front of them. But the self eventually becomes tired of fantasy. The psyche wants truth. The self wants reality. So it initiates a withdrawal of projection. This withdrawal often feels like sudden disillusionment. The empath looks at someone and realizes, I have been speaking to a mask. They realize, I have been loving an idea. They realize, I have been bleeding for someone who wouldn't even notice if I stopped. End quote. And then the empath goes quiet. Here is the image, a projector in a dark room. For years, the empath has been projecting a beautiful film onto a blank wall. The film has love, meaning, hope, redemption. But one day the projector shuts off, the wall becomes empty, and the empath finally sees the wall was always just a wall, the beauty was inside them. In everyday life, this looks like the empath no longer justifying, no longer explaining away patterns, no longer interpreting cruelty as stress, no longer translating neglect into they're busy. They stop, they watch, they listen, and their silence is not emptiness, it is observation without fantasy. This is why an empath's quiet can feel chilling to others, because the empath stops projecting goodness onto them. They stop making them seem larger than they are. They stop rescuing their image. They stop offering spiritual alibis for their behavior. Silence becomes a mirror with the light turned on. Take a quiet pause. Breathe more slowly. Ask yourself, who do you become when you no longer get to be seen through someone else's kindness? Some people collapse when the empath withdraws projection because they were living inside it like a borrowed palace. Mini story. There is a woman named Camille. Camille is an empath who has been in a friendship with someone named Rina for 8 years. Rina is charismatic, needy, dramatic. Camille has always understood her, always excused her, always forgiven her. Then one day Rina makes a comment small, casual, but cruel. Camille laughs politely, then later feels something crack. She replays years of similar moments. She realizes she has been swallowing disrespect as if it were normal. The next time Rina texts with another emotional crisis, Camille reads it and feels nothing. No impulse to help, no urgency, only clarity. She doesn't respond immediately. Hours pass. Rina sends more messages, then guilt, then anger. Camille stays quiet. For the first time, she lets Rina sit in her own life without a rescue. Camille's projection has withdrawn. The friendship begins to die, and in that death, Camille begins to live. Jung would say this withdrawal is a necessary act of individuation. When projection returns to its source, the psyche gains power. You stop leaking your soul into other people's shadows. And once you see this, the next layer is inevitable. When projection is withdrawn, the empath must confront what remains their own shadow. Number 12. The empath's quiet is the moment the shadow becomes louder than the persona. The empath often fears their own shadow. They fear their anger, their selfishness, their coldness, their desire to leave. They fear that if they acknowledge these things, they will become bad. They fear becoming like those who harmed them, so they overcorrect. They become excessively kind, excessively tolerant, excessively forgiving. They try to live as pure light. But the psyche is not designed for purity, it is designed for wholeness. A person without shadow is not holy. They are split, and what is split becomes dangerous because what is denied acts out unconsciously. So the empath's quiet is often the early stage of shadow integration. The empath does not suddenly become cruel, they become honest, and honesty can feel cruel to those accustomed to manipulation. Here is the image: a lake at night. On the surface, calm; beneath, deep currents; beneath, creatures moving. The empath's persona has been the calm surface. The shadow has been the moving depths. When the empath goes quiet, it is as if the lake becomes transparent. Suddenly, the depths are visible, and the empath sees, I am not only gentle, I am also fierce. I am not only forgiving, I am also done. I am not only loving, I am also capable of leaving. It's our in daily life. This looks like the empath refusing to be soft on someone who keeps stepping on them. It looks like the empath not caring if they are misunderstood. It looks like the empath letting someone feel consequences. It looks like the empath enjoying solitude without guilt. It looks like the empath feeling a quiet satisfaction when they finally stop overgiving, not out of revenge, but out of justice. Mini story. There is a man named Noah. Noah is an empath who grew up as the peacemaker. In his family, conflict was dangerous. He became the calm one. As an adult, Noah dates someone who constantly tests him: jealous games, subtle insults, emotional threats. For years, Noah tries to respond with gentleness. One night, his partner says something cruel about Noah's weakness. Noah feels anger rise like a fire. But instead of exploding, he becomes silent. He looks at his partner with a new expression, one that has no fear. Noah says quietly, I'm not available for this anymore. Then he leaves the room. His partner follows, trying to provoke a reaction. Noah stays quiet. In that quiet, his shadow has entered the relationship not as violence, but as authority. Noah's partner feels the change immediately. Because a person who integrates shadow cannot be controlled by shame. Jung believed that shadow integration produces a new kind of calm, not the calm of fear, but the calm of power. When you no longer need to be perceived as good, you become dangerous in the healthiest way. You become free. And once you see this, that is why the empath's silence often feels final, because it is the voice of the integrated psyche. Number 13. The empath's quiet forces, a spiritual audit. What is this relationship really built on? When an empath stops speaking, the relationship becomes exposed. Words often act as insulation. They soften reality, they fill gaps, they distract. But when silence enters, reality becomes naked. Was the relationship mutual or was it transactional? Was it built on love or on the empath's labor? Was it built on respect or on access? Did the other person value the empath or the function the empath served? Silence reveals all of this because it removes performance. Here is the image, a stage after the play ends. The audience has left. The lights are off. Costumes hang empty. Makeup wipes away. The actor stands alone and asks, "Who am I when I stop acting?" The empath's quiet is the stage after the performance. It is the end of pretending. It is the moment the empath refuses to keep entertaining the same emotional script. In everyday life, this is why people panic. They were used to the empath filling the room with warmth. When the warmth leaves, the room becomes cold and they discover they never brought their own heat.